And, so I'm Penelope, for those of you who haven't met me before, and I'm going to outline my research on the origins of the Alexander technique. And this is an outline because next week I'll be launching an 8-module course, fleshing it all out for those who want to take it further. So I'm going to talk for about 3/4 of an hour first to give you the whole picture, and we'll do some explorations as part of that, and then I'll open it up for everybody to chat and comment. So if you have questions and comments, store them up. I'm ready for the end. So excuse the noise left. The dog is being caught and put somewhere where he can't disturb us. So we all love the use of the self story, and we tell it all the time. It's fantastic for telling to pupils. It's inspiring. But does it actually fit the facts as we now know it? So when I did my book, 3.5 years ago, it was published now. Many of you will know it. I gave another account of how the Alexander technique evolved, but actually there were inaccuracies in it. And I knew there were inaccuracies. I'm just going to mute you, Wes. That I knew there were inaccuracies, unfortunately, at the time it went to press, because I wrote the history section of it when I was very first writing. And then as time went by, I realized there were inaccuracies, but I had to prioritize the science. So the science won, getting the last attention before it went to the publishers. And I thought, well, no worries, because I knew that when it went to the publishers, I'd have a year. And I thought, well, I'll work on the research behind the history at that point and get it right before publication, and also do a backup document that would give the background to what and the references to what I was saying. But that's when COVID broke. So I was plunged into online teaching, and I never got to do that research. So unfortunately, the book went to press with inaccuracies in it and not sufficiently backed up. And after a while, two, prominent members of the community, wrote, well, one of them rather unpleasant things, and the other, Jan Fisher, wrote a detailed, this is wrong, this is wrong, this is wrong, this is wrong, which is fair. I knew there were inaccuracies there, and that actually said to me, I've got to do something about this. So I started researching it, thinking it would be a few months of work to, get a document together to put it all straight. And the more I researched, the more it opened up like a giant cauliflower, as A.R. once said. And 3 years later, and a new picture has now emerged, which I think it's fascinating what's emerged. So some parts of the new story are based on known fact, and others of it are necessarily speculative, but I think it gives us the best guess we can get that takes account of all the known facts. That's my aim. So let's define the problem, the inconsistencies between that lovely use of the self account and the facts as we now know them. And the first of these is that we now know that Alexander, for the first 14 years, was teaching natural breathing and elocution, and the use of the self account makes no mention of this. Breathing is given as the problem. At no point does he give breathing as the solution in that account. We also know that he studied and also taught the Delsarte system early on. His Sydney business card from round about 1900 offers, along with voice and breathing work, the famous Delsarte system as applied to dramatic expression, deportment, gesture, and vocalization. And it has been suggested that Alexander developed his work out of this. The French teacher, Jean de Massuero, for those of you who know of him, thought that FM's work, or at least he thought a few years ago, I don't know if he still does, but he certainly thought at that point that Alexander work was in many ways Delsarte work repackaged. Now, I don't think that. And the more I have researched this, the more it becomes apparent that FM really was a genius. And we now really recognize that all geniuses take a little idea from here and an idea from there and a big idea from here and put it into a great melting pot and then produce amazing new ideas of their own. And so the question becomes, to what extent was the Delsarte work a springboard for the Alexander work? And what can we learn by investigating the Delsarte methods? And then a third conundrum, and you can put your answer in the chat if you like for this one. How many years did it take to develop the Alexander work? I was always understood that it was 10 years, but I've heard 8 years, 14 years, 12 years. People seem to have different versions of this. But we now know that he was teaching within round about a year of having voice problems. And somehow it looked like Alexander work. There's a tale of an elderly woman who came in the 1940s for lessons to Ashton Place. And she said that she had been one of Alexander's very first students back in Auckland, back in 1895. And it had made such an impression on her, she'd always wanted another lesson. And 50 years later, she found herself in London and sought him out and took another lesson. And apparently she went away down the road smiling. Alexander came out and said to Carrington, my goodness, what must I have been doing with my hands back in those days? Which is interesting. So he evidently was using his hands, but how and what was he doing and so on. Hello, Andrea. And by the way, hello, Teresa. I didn't spot you. So the use of the, so what was he teaching then? Was he first a breathing man and then he developed the Alexander technique as two distinct techniques? And that's rather suggested by Jerome Starring. Or was he teaching Alexander technique right from the start, but calling it breathing work because this was the topic of the day? And I gather that that's rather what Carrington assumed. Or is there a third possibility that what he was doing looked like Alexander technique, but in certain ways wasn't? And I think that's what we're investigating here. Use of the Self, that lovely account, was published round about the beginning of the first training course in 1932, and it became the manual of the course, effectively. This is what you're trying to do. And it was presented also as the method to follow. But really, it's the goal. It's what Alexander could do after he'd been working for 30 plus years. And he said, you can do what you do if you do what I did, but none of you want the discipline. But what if the real problem was that there were multiple aspects that he didn't tell us? And probably he didn't tell us these things for very good reasons. Maybe we know there are various aspects of the work that he never clarified, he never defined. Other aspects, I think he'd moved on in his development and he'd lost interest in them, so why talk about them? And I suggested in the book that perhaps he'd suppressed some elements, and I'm still sort of wondering if that sometimes is the case. Again, there may be very good reasons why he chose to do that, not to confuse his students or muddy the waters, or who knows. So he always so this isn't just an academic exercise that we're, hello, Jessica, I didn't know you were coming. It's lovely. So this isn't just an academic exercise. If we are to do what he did, we really need to know what he did, and then we really can follow in his footsteps. And Alexander always said it's all in the books, which it isn't, but that's subject for another talk. But he was very clear that the books always needed to be in print in his lifetime. The problem with reading the earlier books is that because we've taken the use of the self-account as true, that we then try to interpret those earlier books in the light of the use of the self-account. And I think that is what makes them so very hard to understand. And so I want to show you the books from another perspective. Forget the use of the self-account for the moment and read those earlier books and the first articles as early instructions. And another picture emerges, I think, that gives us ground floor experiences. And again, this is what we will really be investigating in the course I'm going to be doing. There's a lot of instruction in that early writing, if we know what to look for among the guff and the overwriting that he goes in for. So let's start at the beginning, because the Alexander technique has its origins really at Alexander's own birth, because he was born premature. He was born premature 34 to 37 weeks is what's been estimated. And preterm babies struggle to breathe because their lungs are not yet fully developed. Every breath is hard work. Every breath is a life or death struggle. So they developed strategies to help themselves. You see, the premature baby's lung, it's not yet got the vascularization. It's not got enough air sacs. The membrane is not yet permeable to air. It's too thick. There's no surfactant, so the lung is likely to collapse at every moment. Everything is against breathing. And it's like blowing up a very, very stiff rubber balloon every breath. And the person I got this from was the teacher. Well, she still is a preterm baby nurse. And she also then became an Alexander teacher, Jennifer Kello. And so she says prem babies often grunt at the end of an out breath to stop the air sacs collapsing. And that depresses the larynx. And then they have to pull in like fury on the in-breath, which means that they lift the chest, arch the back, narrow the back, pull the head back, and flare their nostrils. And it's all very hard work. So I want to start by asking everybody to try that. Be a premature baby. And maybe some of you were even premature babies. And so just try that. Just grunt on the out breath and then breathe in hard, pulling everything back and up. Just imagine you're trying to breathe in through a thick rubber bag. It's incredibly hard work, isn't it? And this is what creates the feeding problem in premature babies, because every breath they take, they're pulling their heads back hard. And then when they try to swallow, the passages are all wrong, and so they vomit. And this is why a lot of premature babies die. And Alexander's mother was dedicated. She fed milk into him drop by drop from a fountain pen dropper. And that's how she got the milk into him, so she could get past that. But what this means, Alexander, like all preterm babies, never experienced a normal breath. This is where he started. And what Jennifer Kello suggests is that because this is the strategy a preterm baby learns to do in order to survive, it stays with this breathing pattern, and they kick them into adulthood. And she has then done interviews of adults who are preterm and discovered they're still using those breathing patterns. And many of them report that breathing is hard work. It's a struggle every breath. And we will go more into FM's childhood on the course that I'm going to develop. And actually, Jen's given me her paper for anyone who is on the course to read. What we know then about FM was that he was a very delicate child who had to stay in a lot. But round about the age of 8, his health improved and he was able to go out and start having a normal childhood. And that also fits with the preterm, because it's at age 8 that the preterm lung catches up. And he then did a lot of work, not just running around in the countryside and doing normal childhood things, but he did a lot of riding and training horses. And from age 10, he didn't even have to go to school. So he was spending his days riding horses, training horses, observing in nature. And it's been speculated by other people besides myself, did he then build a lot of skills from that? Because as a delicate child, as not a very strong child, he would not have had the strength to bully a horse into following his will, as bigger people often do. he would have had to build skills in observation of movement. He'd have to learn to calm the horse. His parents were apparently very, very skilled horsemen, and his father could calm any horse, being a blacksmith. So he had good tutors there. He would have had to learn to make connections with that horse, maybe across space, directing their use through his will. So he might have learned a tremendous amount from that horse experience. And then at age 17, he moved to Warriter, to the tin mines, to work as a clerk. And that's where he discovered acting. And he was there for 4 years. And obviously his passion for acting grew. So in 1889, he moved to Melbourne to go to the theatres and to begin to do more training as an actor. And he supported himself with clerical jobs. And I and others believe that this is when he learned the Delsarte stuff as part of his acting training. So what did he learn, and who was Delsarte? So Delsarte, Francois Delsarte, was born in France between 1811. In 1811, he died in 1871, and he never left France. He never wrote anything, and he only spoke French. I suggested in the book, and others have suggested, that Alexander might have learned the Delsarte method through Camille Delsarte, Francois's brother, who actually moved to Tasmania. But there's no evidence he was teaching anything other than singing, and it doesn't match up. So I think that we can put aside. That was not how he learned Delsarte. So Francois Delsarte, he was a beautiful singer, and he went to the Paris Conservatoire, where he received, he saw it as very poor instruction. It was just idiosyncratic, copy this style, copy that style, and there was no method to it. And although he did go on and graduated and then performed for several years, after a while his voice failed, and he blamed the poor instruction he'd received. And he said to himself, there must be a more systematic way of training actors and singers. And so he set about observing thousands and thousands of people doing natural things and observing their gestures and the movements they made in response to real life situations. And he codified that, and he developed what he called the Delsarte system of gestural training, in which you could channel the inner feeling as an outer gesture. And it was the first systematic way of training actors, allowing for natural expression on stage rather than the rather formal stagey stuff that had been there up till now. And what he saw was that people had poor habits of movement because their minds were tangled with their bodies. He saw that they were over-involved with their bodies. And that if we are to let go of habits, we have to withdraw the mind from the body. We have to let go mentally. And then the nerve force can rush through the resultant free channels, which balances the muscles, frees the joints, and improves the coordinations. And then one can let the feelings on the inside become gestures on the outside. So you can see there's a lot of parallels there. His work was very, very successful in France. It was from about 1840 to 1860. Then he semi-retired. And then in 1870 or 1869, he had his last pupil, an American called Steele MacKay, who trained with him every day for 6 months, and then took the work back to America. But he also developed what he called harmonic gymnastics, because he said the French gesticulate freely and naturally, whereas the Americans have rather stiff bodies. Sorry if I'm insulting nations here, but that's what they said. And so he developed harmonic gymnastics in order to prepare the American body for the subtleties of the gestural training. So it took off like a rocket, because America also was hungry for a systematic way of training actors and a natural way. And so it became the dominant way of training actors for 30 years, 1870 to 1900. And then popular books followed, the first of whom was Genevieve Stebbins, which was a roaring bestseller, because she didn't just appeal to actors, but also to the general public, and also to ladies who wanted to learn to move with elegance and grace and poise and coordinate better and feel more confident walking into a room and sitting down and standing up. And it became the yoga of the day. You went to your weekly Delsarte lesson. How did that all come to Melbourne? Because this was the strand of the Delsart that Alexander would have learnt. Melbourne at that time was a thriving city. It had a lot of different theatres, and promoters were bringing in actors from all the way around the world who would, in all probability, have been trained in this Delsart method. The Australians would have been interested. They would have brought books over. They would have, I don't know, given workshops. Who knows? I can't find any outer evidence, but I think it just happened quite organically. Oh, you're interested? Here's a book. I'll get another copy when I get home, whatever. And so I think they made their way into Australia, and it had to be there because Alexander learnt it. So Australia was also open to natural methods because Hartley, C.S. Hartley, Hartley, who he first quotes, his little pamphlet is called Natural Elocution. So there's already a hunger in Australia for natural methods also. So let's do the very first exercise that is in all Delsartian textbooks. And if Alexander studied Delsart, he would have done this one. And it's called the Decomposition and Recomposition. Wonderful titles, wonderful names. So it means to take apart and to put together again. So if everyone wants to stand up and just put your arm out to the side, you can watch me first or do it along with me, whichever you like. So what I'm going to do is withdraw my nerve force, withdraw my will back from my fingers to my knuckles so that my fingers fall as if dead. And I can come along and just flick them. They're just now dead things. And then I'm going to withdraw my will back to the wrist. And my hand now has become a dead thing. I can shake it. There's no life there anymore. I can then withdraw my will back to the elbow. And my whole lower arm is now a passive, wobbly, dead thing. And now I'm going to withdraw it back to the shoulder. And in fact, Stebbins says, withdraw it back to the reservoirs at the base of the brain. That's where you were supposed to withdraw it to. But, I think you could play with that. And then we've now got an empty vessel with the nerve force, with the mind drawn out of it. And now we can send that direction back through again, that nerve force back through again. So we're going to send energy back through the up arm to the elbow. And the arm comes back into life. And now I'm going to send it through to the wrist. The hand is still decomposed. I'm going to send it through to the knuckles and then all the way to the fingers. And the perceptive might actually feel that something is withdrawing and something is coming back again. Let's do it one more time. Just withdrawing the nerve force back to the knuckles so that the fingers fall as if dead. Withdrawing it back to the wrist, withdrawing it back to the elbow, withdrawing it back to the shoulder and even to the base of the brain. Alexander writes in use of the self, there's a little footnote. When I use the phrases, when I use the word direction, as in phrases such as I directed the use, I'm referring not only to projecting messages from the brain to the mechanisms of movement, but also in conducting the energy necessary to the use of these mechanisms. So here we are conducting the energy necessary to the upper arm. And now we'll conduct the energy necessary to the forearm. And now through to the knuckles, and now through to the fingertips. Now take that hand for a little dance in the air and just marvel at how free your arm is now, how coordinated, how fluidly it moves, and also perhaps how well you know where the joints are and in what planes those joints move. There's a lot of body mapping, I think, that we can get from this. Let's just play with the other arm just to balance things up. You're going to start by decomposing it. Just withdraw the energy back to the knuckles. The fingers fall as if dead, the thumb as well, let that go too. Back to the wrist. Withdraw it back to the elbow. Withdraw it back to the shoulder. Check that the whole thing is just decomposed. It's just a floppy thing, like that wonderful time that Harry Potter lost all the bones in his arm because Professor Lockhart magicked them out, and his arm dangled like a rubber ball, as it were. And then we're going to recompose, like Harry just growing his joints again, his bones again, courtesy of Madame Pomfrey's wonderful medicine. Sorry, for those of you who aren't Harry Potter fans and don't know these references, flowing it through to the wrist, flowing it through to the knuckles, flowing it through to the fingers. And again, just withdrawing it. Just withdrawing it. The life is going out of the arm. It's just a dead thing. And flowing it back through. You might notice that one arm is different from the other arm. And Stebbins encouraged you to use a mirror, give your reflection the lesson, and to practice faithfully for many hours a day. Again, just take that hand for a little dance and see what it's like. So decomposition and recomposition. I use this with new pupils too, to help them when I take their arm on the table and they don't let go. Withdraw the energy, then I can take their arm. Now send your energy back through and see if you can leave that arm free. It's a very clear instruction, I find, to that pupils understand. So yes, and in the new course, we'll investigate a lot more of these Delsartian exercises and methods, and we'll also compare how they relate to FM's methods. Do sit down again. Have a moment. So I think that Alexander had a good foundation in the Delsart work before he had his voice problems, because this would have given him the knowledge that all poor habits have their roots in the mind, that you have to let go of these to allow something different, which can feel wrong. Some of the Delsartians comment that when things change, it feels wrong. I think it gives a very clear set of body mapping. You know where your joints are, the planes they move in, a secure awareness of your body in space, what it's doing, and then, of course, how to convey emotions and meaning through that body. And the Delsart work has a lot of precise games to play around, you know, what's a that hand, what's a that hand, and so on. All the different experiments of what a different hand can express, or a face, so on. But just the body mapping, the control of the body that it brings, I think, is tremendous. There's also early forms of procedures in the Delsart work, such as coming on toes, sitting and standing, taking a step and walking. They talk about oppositions. Some of those oppositions really bring in antagonistic action. And all of it is to be done with what Delsart called harmonic poise, which I think Alexander would later rename mechanical advantage. You can really see a lot of his key ideas in that early work. Well, Alexander got very good at acting and he started winning competitions. And that's when he decided to turn professional. And he upped his time spent on the exercises and the training, and his voice gave out. Because his poor health had continued. With breathing attacks and lowered vitality, he'd had sympathetic bosses. He tells us about this in his little autobiography that he wrote in the 1950s. He'd had sympathetic bosses who'd let him take work home and do it in his own time. And he'd had a more serious attack that his doctor had ordered him to the seaside for 3 months to recuperate, because Melbourne, like all major cities in those days, was very polluted. All the coal fires creating smogs and things. And the number one killer of the population in those days was tuberculosis, and the second biggest killer was bronchitis. Respiratory diseases were the major killers. This was a very serious concern. So when Alexander was better enough to return to Melbourne, he moved in with his voice coach, Fred Hill, whose father had been T.E. Hill, the famous orator who'd written the most famous book on oratory at the time. Fred's father had now died, and I think it's Rosalind MacLeod who speculated he would have had a good library of books around breathing and voice production and oratory, and they would have landed in on Fred's shelves. And so when Alexander had his voice problems, living in Fred's house, he would have had access, probably, we can speculate, to a wonderful library of books on the subject. And I think in those days, he was somebody who looked to books for solutions. AR tells us that whenever you looked at him, he had his nose in a book. Although what age he's referring to, we don't know. So in the first articles that he writes, he quotes from 3 different authors: Hartley on natural elocution, Brown and Benke, who wrote the most scientific treatise on voice production of the day, and also Koffler, which was, again, another book that had sprung out of Brown and Benke. And they were really looking at the mechanics of breathing and the science of breathing and voice production, not just handing down ad hoc ideas that could be incorrect. And all these books agree that if you have voice problems, that you have to start by looking to your breathing. You cannot start with the voice. Almost everybody with voice problems is using that clavicular breathing. And you have to let go of that and discover how to breathe with the whole torso in order before you can begin to work with your voice. And surely that would have resonated with FM with his whole history of breathing problems. So this is where FM started. And this is what he explains in those early articles, that that's what you have to do. You have to work with your breathing because everybody uses the clavicular breathing. Nobody's breathing well if they've got voice problems. But right from the start, I think he's doing something different. Both Brown and Benke and Koffler do stress, most authors just go for the in-breath. The out-breath and how you produce the out-breath is just as important. And Alexander also says, you know, I don't just focus on the out-breath, on the in-breath. The out-breath is the more important one. But he takes it further. And the aphorism that's in our little book of aphorisms, that's for those who've got that, if I don't breathe, I breathe. And in 1908, he says, if you want to tell someone how to breathe, tell him not to breathe. Years later, he would tell Frank Pierce Jones that he learned to use his hands in a different way for teaching by applying the inhibitory control, which had proved so effective in breathing and speaking. So this is where he discovered inhibition, I think, is through breathing work. And it would seem this was the key to his unique method, waiting at the end of the out-breath, inhibiting the habitual in-breath so that the body's organizational systems take over and then organize a spontaneous and natural full breath. And he writes, I do not claim to have discovered any new method of breathing, but to understand the only true one, nature's. Right from the start, I think he's using undoing, not doing as the cornerstone of his method. And that's not in the Delsart system at all. Let's just add that one in. So if everyone would like to lie down on the floor with a book under your head, and we'll have a go at this. Now, to what extent this idea of weight on the bottom of the out-breath and let the in-breath happen was around at the time, we don't know. Malcolm Williamson suggests that it was in the bel canto tradition, and they called it, I think, the exquisite moment, waiting for the exquisite moment at which the in-breath just does itself. And Emily Bishop, who's one of the Delsartian authors, she gave a method like this but a little bit too late, in 1895, I think. So he couldn't have used it in 1893. And Brown and Benke's daughter actually produced a method like this. That's not produced till 1926, but maybe it was. So we don't know to what extent this idea was around, but not very formally used. So if you're lying down, but of course the difference with FM is that other people just use that inhibitory method to get the breath going, but then return to more active methods. Whereas for FM, he was using these inhibitory methods throughout his method. And that's very much the difference of his work. So Let's put one hand on the chest and one hand on the belly, and you're just going to wait at the bottom of the out breath and wait for the in-breath to do itself. I find it helps to look out at the room so that you don't focus in on the breath. But let's perhaps add in that, whether Alexander would have done this, I don't know, but let's just play, because we know he would have had this idea of withdrawing the life force from somewhere. So let's withdraw the life force from our chest. Actually, sorry, back up. Let's just start by doing some clavicular breathing. Let's just start by working too hard at it. So this is where FM might have started, with far too much going on in the upper chest. You might feel it tightening, curling your back. You might feel it tightening your neck, making sniffing noises in your nostrils, flaring the nostrils. All this hard work going on. And you might notice that when you do that, nothing is happening in your diaphragm. Very little is happening in your rib cage. Nothing is happening in your abdomen. It's all going on up in the upper chest. Very inefficient breathing. So let's come back now to just waiting at the bottom of the out breath. And now let's just withdraw the energy from the clavicles. And you can withdraw it to the energy in the base of the brain. Tai Chi people might like to withdraw it to the dantian. You can withdraw it to the top of the head, as Goldie would later teach me to do. Just withdrawing it so that the chest can fall, the rib cage can fall, and just waiting. It can be a surprisingly long time. We're not holding the bottom of the out breath, you're just waiting, resting there, staying out of the way until nature's way takes over and the in-breath comes. Withdrawing the energy from the rib cage, withdrawing it from the abdomen, withdrawing it from the back. And you might be aware of different muscles coming into play all by themselves. That the diaphragm now initiates the breath. The ribs ride on the breath. The belly muscles come naturally into play. Nothing is overworking, nothing is underworking. Just keep decomposing at the end of each out breath, making that pause, just waiting for the in-breath to do itself. Just waiting. Keeping the mind out of it. Staying out of your own way. You're just observing it. You might notice your back coming into play. The whole torso expands a little bit all the way round. Nothing is taking over, nothing is underworking. Just waiting. So this is a pure inhibitory process. A very quiet process, a very calming process. And I think it would be an amazing place for Alexander to start. What must it have felt like to him when he first experienced a natural breath? Moving your way off the floor when you're ready. He later told George Trevelyan, "A man has not lived till he can widen his back." He didn't say free his neck. He didn't say send his head forward and up. He said widen his back. And in his articles, in those early articles, those first 14 years, he describes breathing as poor breathing as the cause of all health and posture problems, because of course they were for him. You know, his poor breathing problems had been what created his own core problems, and he saw that breath was primary. So what we've just done is we've begun to find the thoracic mechanism, as he calls it, the natural movement of the rib cage that then can organize the whole body, actually. And he then called the resulting movement primary movement. And we'll explore the full method of this in my course, in the course that we're doing, because there's more to it than that. There's very detailed instructions in those early articles, which we'll be using, and they work. So this thoracic mechanism, he said it gives the primary movement. Now, because people read use of the self as the primary text, they assumed, well, a lot of people have assumed that that primary movement he describes is the little forwards and up movement of the head on the neck. And I don't believe that is so, because although in those early articles he does talk about taking the head up, because head back, after all, will stop anybody breathing or speaking properly, it's actually in all the singing and breath instructors of the time. It's not an unusual instruction. All the acting schools, everybody is telling you to put your head forward and straighten the spine, straighten the neck spine. I don't think he's interested in the torso at that point, and in the neck at that point, the head and the neck. He's interested in the torso, and it's the instructions on the torso are the only ones he italicizes. That's where he's interested, in the torso mechanism. So where does the use of the self account fit into this? So Jean Fischer's pointed out that in use of the self, it's the discovery of how to prevent the pulling back of the head, which actually decreased his hoarseness and allowed his larynx and vocal cords to improve. The discovery that the head goes forward and up comes much later, doesn't get mentioned until 1911, I think, and primary control doesn't get defined until 1925. So all that is much later. And this initial discovery of leaving the head alone could have been made through the breathing work, enough to mend his voice to act again and then begin working with others. But no doubt, because he was working so early on, he would have gained experience, and he was working on himself, of course, as well. He would have gained experience of working on pupils and perhaps started to observe the importance of that head-neck relationship and how it then relates to the back and how it then relates to the breathing. And so slowly his understanding of that head-neck-back understanding emerged out of what he was doing. And that, I suspect, is the way around it happened. But it's speculation to say. Breathing and voice were the hot topics of the day. Voice problems were a major issue. I think in the 19th century, the population expanded, the churches got much bigger, the public halls got much bigger, and the poor vicars and lawyers and mayors of the town and so on, they were all having to speak in these vast spaces to huge numbers of people, and there were no PA systems. They were forcing their voices, and that's where they all got clergyman's throat and so on. And then there was all the bronchial problems and so on. So Alexander's first lessons were for actors and voice. And I believe that in those early lessons, he was teaching people to breathe, but as part of that, he had to get their bodies into awareness and life to free off the thoracic mechanism. So I speculate that he started doing bits of the Delsart work with them, coming on toes, standing in balance, taking a step. Other authors, the breathing authors, give leaning on the back of a chair to open the back, which maybe have been where sort of semiflexion began. And he already had observation skills, we can speculate. Through his work with horses, he knew how to observe movement. He also knew how to direct a horse with intention and voice. Did he then apply that to his pupils? He had a sense of his own body through the Delsart work. So he had a good sense of where his body was and what it was doing. But one could presume that most of his pupils didn't have that. And that's why he then started to put his hands on, quite organically, to show them where, that's where your head goes up. You're pulling your head back, put it up. That's where you're compressing your ribs. He might have taken an arm to help them pull their ribs out. And so the hands-on work emerged quite naturally out of what he was trying to do with people. there are the various voice teachers also give physical exercises to do, but I don't see any parallels with these, with what Alexander's doing. Other people have suggested there were physical therapists around at the time also doing sort of parallel things, and the Roths are often mentioned, but the Roths are about straightening spines. And again, I don't see that as appealing. I think the Delsart work is much more suited because it's beautiful, it's flowing, it comes from the mind, it's much more suited to the way Alexander was working. And through the earliest articles, 1894 to 1903 particularly, you can sense this young man, Alexander, finding his voice. He stops using other people's expressions. He stops pinching bits wholesale out of other people's articles and starts being able to express what he's doing for himself. 1903, he conceives writing a book, a self-help book, How to Breathe, How to Get Fit. It never gets written, but he's already finding himself in the process. And that's, of course, when he then moved to London in 1904, still teaching breathing and voice work. And he had letters of recommendation from the doctors he'd worked with back in Australia to doctors in London. And the one who picked up on it was Dr. Spicer, who was a foremost voice and voice problems specialist himself. And the two men got along very well, and they learned a lot from each other. But then, in 1908 to 1909, several things happened together. Alexander started to suspect that Spicer was stealing his methods. And Spicer even wrote an article in which he recommended the principles that he advocates should only be taught by qualified medical men and not be exploited by some irregular hypnotists, suggestion healers, physical or vocal trainers. Now, this would have been pretty threatening to Alexander, you know, if his methods had been stolen by a doctor who was leader in the field. And he split with Spicer. He wrote a great protest about him and split. And it's at this moment that he changes his focus from breath as causative of all health problems and postural problems to how you use your body as causative of all health and breathing problems. And so he completely turns the thing the other way up. And of course, he's not shy of making enormous claims that what he's doing can cure everything. Good old FM. So he writes an article in 1908 called The Re-Education of the Kinesthetic Systems. It doesn't mention breathing at all. And this, I think, is where the Alexander work begins, as we know it today. 14 years after its beginning in Tasmania. And in Man's Supreme Inheritance, he talks about the head going forward and up. He starts to talk about chair work, and there's the Alexander work as we know it. So why did he make that shift? Did he make it just because of Spicer? Or did he also make it because breath had been his own primary problem, but maybe as he observed other people, he observed that their primary problems were better suited if you came at them from the physical side, from the body side, rather than from the breath side. And he started saying breath isn't primary, it's not even secondary, it's tertiary. You look after the consciousness, that looks after the body, and that looks after the breath. And that became what we then all learned. So there we have it. I've presented my solutions to those original inconsistencies and conundrums, and that's what we'll be exploring in the new course. But right now, over to you. Tell me what you think. I'm longing to hear what you think of all this that I've just presented. So who would like to speak? David.
This now makes sense of the whispered R. It never, I knew the whispered R was good for voice work, and my voice seems pretty good, possibly as a result of having done a lot of it 30 or more years ago, but I've done almost none since then. But this now, this completes the picture.
Yeah, thank you. Yes. Anybody else like to comment? Don't be shy. Gabrielle.
I found very interesting this taking out the thinking, or what was your phrase? withdraw the thinking or so. And it reminded me very much of mind in the brain. Keep your mind in the brain and do the work anyway.
Yes, yes, I think there's real parallels there, aren't there, to that phrase Goldie gave me, that I think came from FM. But it is withdrawing the will force, because Goldie didn't want me to go as a dead thing. She wanted to have that recomposed stage, as it were, where there was tone. So there is a slight difference. But yes, we can move our minds around, and that may be where that thought became. And he writes in Man's Supreme Inheritance, I think, where he does the door procedure, where you lean back against the door, and he says, cut, as it were, the energy from the legs. So, again, there he is using that same idea. Leslie.
Hi, Penelope. When we were on the floor, I actually found that quite difficult to withdraw. When I was down there, I felt as if, well, nothing's happening. Is it happening? Isn't it happening? But actually, it was happening. Because I'm one of these people, well, I found all those years ago when I started training as an Alexander teacher, that was when I learned that I spent the whole of my life up to that point not breathing. How on earth I was still alive, I have no idea, actually. But most of the time I was holding my breath.
Yes.
So that's part of my habitual way of going on is now, as we know, we don't suddenly lose it after all those years. It creeps back in when it can, it'll creep back in. But having been on the floor and just towards the end, for the first time, I think, in my life, when I've done semi-supine, if you like, my back actually did widen.
Wow.
And sort of go towards the floor, which I found absolutely amazing. It's almost bringing tears to my eyes somehow. It's never happened like that, in that way. So somehow, whatever I was doing with the withdrawing must have been the right thing, or, just work on it, I guess.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's so interesting, Leslie. You see, in CCC, Constructive Conscious Control, he writes about telling a singer to do a pause at the bottom of the out breath, to let go of your habit, and then let the in breath come in. But I think to change, and that's all very well, a sort of a pause and then let it come in when you're sitting, but to make a profound change from lifetimes of habit, I think we need to be on the floor doing this very, very quiet, more systematic work. So I don't think he just started the way he describes it in CCC. I think he had to do this much quieter, more still, more precise withdrawing of the energy work to make that shift for himself, because his whole being would have fought against it. It thought that to strain the breathe. Yeah, and I've seen this with people who are committed clavicular breathers. You really have to bring them down. You really have to bring their energy out of here to get them to come out of that pattern. Thank you. Julia.
Yes, I have a question about the procedure on the floor. With regard to something that I think I heard you say about a slight efforting at the very bottom of the exhale, and how this is reconciled with the idea of withdrawing all of the energy. I tried it both ways with both ideas in my head, and holding the breath out, pushing it out very slightly at the end was a very different experience than just withdrawing all the energy from the torso.
Yes.
So,
and I think it's so tempting to do a little push, and we're not doing that. We really are just letting it. Yes. One of the images I use is a leaf falling down the well and falling and falling and falling and falling and falling and falling, because it's amazing how you can continue not to grip that out breath. And then you're out of the way to let something. Is that your experience, Julia? Is that the way around that you?
I was even taught for a while in my training program to exert a little bit of effort at the bottom of the exhale, in a lying down position, and then allow the in-breath to happen. So they're very different experiences, and I prefer where no effort, just it's a mental thing. It's a completely mental phenomenon that causes it to happen.
Yeah, no, we really do want to be completely out of the way so that the hindbrain, and it's interesting that Stebbins says withdraw the energy back to the base, the reservoirs at the base of the brain, because that's where the hindbrain is, which is where the organizational centers of the body are. That's where breathing is organized from. And what we're doing is we're coming out of the front brain and back to the back brain. So she's energizing her back brain to say, you sort it, and also bringing the mind out of the way. So yes, I think it's profound work. Thank you. And I'm glad people are putting their hands up, because I can only see one screen and there's a whole set of people I can't see. So if you're waving and I don't see, please put a hand up. Natalia and Marion, I can see you as well. It's good.
Yeah, so with your new kind of research that you've done, do you think Alexander was using pools like you teach in your first book?
Yeah, well, they come out of the Delsart work, and I'll be investigating those in the course. I haven't talked about those today, but they're bringing about the antagonistic action, and I think they're there in the Delsart work. It's out of, if you're going to come onto your toes without letting your hips push forward, you have to be thinking back. You have to be exerting, directing energy in such a way that it's actually creating an antagonistic action. So I think we're going to be investigating that and discovering where the pulls come from. Yes, absolutely. Thank you. Marion, and then David as well. You're muted, Marion. Can you unmute? Can you find it? David, okay, you got it. Yes.
Okay. So I thought that was a fantastic compilation of, the evolvement of Alexander's process. And but one thing really has always confused me about it, and that's why did he negate feeling in the way he taught the Alexander technique? Why did he insist that everything was about thinking? And by thinking, did he mean observation, or did he mean the activity of the mind? Because everything that you've just described, it had to do with a process of feeling. He was feeling what was happening in his body all the time. I mean, he must have been relying on feeling to tell him what was going on. And science is now discovering that consciousness evolves from feeling, that even the tiniest movement of a cell, there is a consciousness involved, and that comes from feeling. So, it's always confused me that
he doesn't define it. Funnily enough, I'm reading Amanda Cole's book on Marjorie Barstow at the moment, and one of the points she makes is that Alexander put no emphasis for his pupils on them observing and awareness. And you probably know that in my work I distinguish feeling from awareness, and they are different. We absolutely need to be aware of what's happening as this sort of watcher, this observer. What we don't want to be is, the way I define feeling is, the way I learned to define it from Goldie, was that my mind was in the body, trying to work it out within the body, and that's where we get overtangled in our bodies. Now, the way she told me about that when she first explained it suggested it to me that it's one of these things that Alexander knew, but never bothered to put in print, never bothered to clarify. I think there's so much that guy knew. I would like to get him in a corner and say, just tell us all the things that you didn't tell us back then, that you didn't write down. You know, like antagonistic action. We know about it from the Bedford lecture. If we hadn't got the Bedford lecture, we wouldn't have him teaching that. There must be so much that happened. And when you read his pupils' lessons, again, there are absolute nuggets in there. Wow, that wasn't in the books. That wasn't in the books. You know, he did so much. And it's regrettable, I think, that he didn't prioritize that. And that's, I think, why we're left such a confused legacy. You're absolutely right. The mirror work, Lucia comments here. Let's just read this out. Where does he negate feeling? He emphasizes re-educating the sensory appreciation, and that sensory appreciation is central to happiness, etc. Nice, thank you. Thank you, Lucia. I mean, I think the whole re-education of the kinesthetic systems, that emphasis that you can't know what you are, the faulty sensory perception thing, that you can't know when you're right. But of course, he himself worked with the mirror a lot. So he was getting objective evidence. And I have a feeling that I picked up one of his pupils' lessons accounts. He says, well, you know, you think this isn't happened, now put your hand on it and you can feel it is. So I think he was getting a little bit more feeling feedback, observation feedback for pupils than, again, we know about. So I think this is a legacy that's perhaps come down to us. We can't know. Everything we do, it must be wrong if it feels right, which is a very conflicting legacy, I think, and has created a lot of problems. And we need to step back to, I like talking about the primary experience. What is the primary experience? What are we seeing in the mirror? What can we observe with our own hands? What can we observe by lining ourselves up against the line on the wall? You know, we can get primary information. But it is an issue. So thank you for highlighting that one. Anyone else like to comment on that one? Because I think it's there's so many topics one can talk about with FM. Wes, you're nodding there. Do you have something to add?
Yeah, I was trying to just put it in the chat that I don't really get the sense that FM was saying that we should not feel or we negate our feeling, but that we can't trust it.
Yeah, that's
That
a good way of saying
it was unreliable, and he called it debauched kinesthesia, saying it was unreliable sensory appreciation. But it always seemed to me that he, in a way, he did. Maybe he didn't talk about attention and awareness enough, but it's almost like he may have assumed this, that in order to do these things you have to be paying attention. You know, that attention and awareness is at the core of the whole thing, but it almost seems like it was unspoken in a way, if that makes sense. Like it was so basic that maybe he forgot to even mention it.
I think that's very interesting, because there's so many things he got from his own childhood that were so second nature to him. I don't think he saw that it was a problem for other people.
Right, exactly. And anyway, it just seems like, yeah, he had to pay attention to himself and what he was doing in order to do all this. So it was almost like assumed that you had to have that attention to do the work. Anyway, I don't know. I'm not expressing it as well as I sometimes do.
You're expressing it beautifully, Les. Thank you. Marion, one more time.
Yes. Well. Oh no. Everything is unreliable. Attention is unreliable.
Yes. Let's leave this topic now. Thank you. And David, you wanted to say something as well, I think.
It was about lying down, but I couldn't remember what it was. Lying down and breathing. It was something I realized or thought was important to say. Can't remember what on earth it was.
Thank you. Marion.
Everything is unreliable. everything. Our thought is unreliable. Our attention is unreliable. We have nothing to rely on. You know, we are creating our own world. We are creating consciousness every moment. That creation is unreliable. The fact that we are sharing the feedback of our attention with each other is really, really helpful to me. I mean, I feel that is showing me what is unreliable in myself too. So,
So I think there is a trend though in Alexander that in his first articles, you can see he's teaching people methods and they're to go home and practice it. And they say his testimonials, I went home and practiced it and now my voice is better. So it is very much about giving the pupil what they need to do to work on. And then, you know, there's this idea that again in 1911, he's giving them orders, he's getting them to do the thinking. And then it starts changing with more emphasis on you can't know it for yourself. You have to have a teacher. And I think there's been a trend towards disempowering the people that we're now turning in the other direction again with an emphasis on awareness for ourselves and being able to do more of it for ourselves. But that's, again, my thought. So, Jessica, I'm longing to hear what you think, my dear. Would you, do you have anything to offer here? I'm longing to hear what, no, thank you. I just thought I'd ask. Would anyone else like to contribute? So let me tell you about the new course. It starts on Wednesday, and it's on Wednesdays every other week. So there's 4 sessions before Christmas and 4 sessions after Christmas, each lasting an hour and a half. It's at 2 o'clock UK time, which would be 9 o'clock in the morning for New York, and a rather earlier start of 6 o'clock for those of you on the West Coast. But also all sessions will be recorded, of course, so people can follow along on the recordings, and people can come in and out if they can do some weeks and not other weeks. I've put the early bird price up again for this weekend. So if you want to join, catch it before Sunday night midnight to catch the early bird offer. And would anyone like to know more? We really will be doing a lot of explorations there of all his breathing instructions, of his Delsart instructions, comparing the Delsart stuff and his own early procedures. We'll be looking in detail. How did he take people in and out of a chair to start with, compared to how we now think about it? I think there's some real interesting stuff that we're going to be looking at and getting a clearer idea about what antagonistic actions are, what directions are. So again, I think in terms of your practical teaching now, it can, to go from this foundational level, can really clarify our ideas of what are these basic principles that we're working with. Wes has just put something else in the chat that looks interesting. I believe the quote was, "You don't know what it is to be alive until you wake in the morning and your back is widening." Right, that's lovely. Yes, and yeah, I remember the first morning that happened to me because it was just so amazing. Yes, anyone else like to ask questions about this material or comment or about the course? Charles, hello.
Hello. I just wondered if you can't actually attend the session, is it something that's just recorded and you get it later?
Yes, absolutely. So, you know, I always send out recordings that night. So some people are planning to follow along who will never be able to attend live, like various people in Korea, it will be 2 in the morning or something. And yes, so you're very welcome to do that if you're not free on your teaching at that point, I presume.
I am usually teaching, yes.
Yes, yes. And again, people are welcome to just pop in for half the session if they're free and so on. It's always good to see people if they can get into the session some of the time.
Good.
Anybody else? David, it'd be lovely if you could join. David.
I'm tempted. I have many pressures. What time period does this cover?
It's say the end of October. It starts
No, I
it's the
mean
30th of October.
in Alexander's life.
In Alexander's life, the first 30 years. So I go up to 1925 when primary control comes along. So it covers the early articles, Man Supreme Inheritance and CCC. And it'll be more based on the earlier stuff and a bit less on the later stuff. But post 1925, that's a whole other course that we may get to do one day.
Out of interest, when did he develop his new use of his hands?
Round about 1914.
So fairly early. Do we
Yes.
know when he met Feldenkrais?
No, I don't. Does anybody know that? I know that it was 1914 because it's when it was the beginning of the First World War, and pupils have declined. The number of pupils have declined, and he went to America. The question, Camilla, was when did Alexander meet Feldenkrais? Do you know that one? So, as I say, the start of his hands, it was when he went to America first, and he had a quieter time. He wasn't teaching so intensively, and so he could be more present to what he was doing. That's the story as I remember it.
I think I'm aware of the story about. I'm not sure where that story of him meeting Feldenkrais comes from. Is it possibly Luli Westfeld?
Camilla thinks it must have been after the 1930s, so that's obviously a bit later.
That sounds likely. In
Yes.
which case, a theory that had been proposed to me is probably invalid.
Right. Okay. That it came out of the Feldenkrais work. Yes. Yeah.
Because that use of the hands and it's I mean, I've always done it as if I'm withdrawing. It's not so much I'm withdrawing energy, but it's like my arms float, my hands float, and they go to the person and they tune into the person. And it's like my hands and arms are listening. They are not active, they are passive. And then they get active if I wish to direct them. And from my experience, limited of Feldenkrais, that was very similar to the thing of move your foot and then think of your foot moving, or whatever. So no, someone I met had known Feldenkrais well and thought that Alexander learned more from Feldenkrais than Alexander claimed Feldenkrais learned from him. But I think the two were not friends on parting, so
Yeah.
they will have different stories. Okay, I'll leave that one.
Yes, Charles Neal. When did Charles Neal study? He wasn't on the first training course. I think he must have been on the second. So it might have been the late 30s, early 40s. Yes. Yeah. And Camilla's suggesting that was his flatmate. Can't have been his flatmate the whole way through because I actually knew Charles Neal's flatmate from later on. Marion.
We heard from Walter Carrington's teachers that Walter actually threw Feldenkrais, or told Alexander that Feldenkrais was stealing his work, and that Alexander took him by the collar and threw him out of his lesson when he heard that. So that's also something I think that would be interesting to check on from some of Walter's teachers.
I don't know about that one at all.
I've heard that story. That's the story I've heard. And I can't remember where that story's from.
Yeah. I think many of Walter's teachers would have heard it.
Wes, did you have another comment?
Well, it was just about when he started using his hands.
Mhm.
I remember I just looked it up in Frank Pierce Jones's book. He says that FM told him that in 1914 he was beginning to find a new way of using his hands by applying the inhibitory control, which had proved so effective in breathing and speaking, to the use of his hands. I'm reading right out of the book,
Yeah.
but that implies also that he was already using his hands.
Well,
And
that's an interesting thing, yes, because I
right,
implied
which
in the
probably in a more crude way, though.
yes. Well, that's what I now understand, because Jando, I originally took my quotes from Jando Masuero, who said Alexander wasn't using his hands before about 1914, but of course that is wrong.
Right.
There's plenty of evidence from what Marjorie Barlow said and his pupil, who turned up in the 1940s. Yeah, he was using his hands, but as you say, just in a more manipulative, demonstrating way, rather than in an energy flowing way or a receptive way.
Right.
And doubtless it emerged over the years. I don't suppose it was a clear cut, but yes, he discovered something about that, and maybe it came to his attention what he was perhaps even already doing, but not defining.
Right.
Yes, it would
Well,
be
I just
fun.
also want to say I really appreciate what you've put together today. I have often, I mean, a long time ago, I determined that the use of the self, well, accurate, was also a almost a legend. Well, it's good. How do I say this? That it's almost like he was putting together like 30 years into one little story. And that he really went down the rabbit hole of breathing and vocal production, and that by working with his students, he eventually formed the whole thing with the primary control and the whole use of the body. That and it's pretty much, you outlined a story which I think conforms with what I started to think over the years. That he went down the rabbit hole and he eventually went from breathing and speaking into this whole body thing, and that the horsey stuff had a lot to do with it too.
Yeah. So it's amazing, isn't it? I think I'm not the only one to say it's there. This story is there to be put together. It's the only logical way to put the story together to me. And there may be other ways, and there will be people who disagree, and that's absolutely fine too, because we can't prove it at this rate. But so thank you, Wes, for that. Marion.
I really admire the way you are open to to discussion with other teachers. I always felt it was a shame that Alexander and Feldenkrais didn't work together, and that teachers these days, I don't know many that do work together either. So, and the openness you have in listening to opinions from other teachers, even if you don't agree with them, you put them into a context of what you're speaking of. And I think that that is such a wonderful attribute of your teaching.
Thank you. When I was a science student in Cambridge, I learned that a hypothesis can never be complete until it encompasses all the known facts. And in the West, we very much liked having these facts versus these facts, but actually we have to encompass all of them. And that's what I try to do. And if there's another fact I haven't included, well, let's change the model until that fits too. I think it's and that is a cooperative effort. That way we can only do that through a cooperation together. And so I'm really happy to share with everybody and hear people's thoughts. And people have been saying, well, this needs to be brought in and include this, and it's wonderful. Thank you all for coming along today. Does anyone else want to share before we finish? So Lily, hello there. Hi, do you want to unmute?
Yes, it's so good to see everyone. I'll echo what she just said about you being open to working with others, and I'll kind of enlarge the context of what we're talking about with this research and Alexander to point out what we all know, that we all have our own biases. And it seems to me, as much as possible, you're looking for the evidence that can, of the writings at the time, rather than just looking for the theory that you want to show. And that's really so important to get at the truth of things. And on another thing about Alexander, I'm not quite sure, and you probably know this, the time frame of when he was reporting his discoveries versus when he made the discoveries. So even himself, if he meant to be saying exactly what was true, he may have misremembered it himself, because again, it's well known we have our own perceptions, and that eyewitnesses under, legal testimony will swear such and such, but they are misremembering it because they were influenced afterwards. So I think that's an important context to this research that you're doing also.
Thank you, Lily. Thank you. Yes, we have to, and we all have to just keep working on this one and keep opening up. Thank you. Yeah. Mary, I think you wanted to say something. And then we'll finish. Yes, we will, by the way, after this session, I'll be sending the recording to everybody. I'll also send out more information about the course and links of how to join in with it. And there's 4 different pricing structures, so hopefully it will meet all needs. If anyone still can't afford it, please get in touch with me, because I'm about inclusion. So yes, you'll be hearing from me after the event. Mary.
I just wanted to say that nature is infinite, and we're form, and we have edges, and our form, according to some, I got this summary of a quote: form is determined by wish and the power of will and visualization. And it's not within our power to go beyond our form unless we admit that we're part of a whole big form.
Yeah, that's lovely. And I'm really taken by the new complexity theory, which very much, I think, starts to define this, that at every level, we're both an individual and part of, just like the cell is part of an organ, and an organ is part of the individual. So we are part of a community, and the community is part of a bigger community. And we're all part of the world, and we're part of the solar system. And it's all this series of, at every level, we are both an individual and part of a greater. And I think it's a fascinating way of thinking about things. And on that profound note, I think we'll finish. So thank you, everybody, for coming today. And like I say, I will send you information afterwards and recording. And please feel free to pass the recording on to friends if you want. And thank you. But don't put it on Facebook. It will go out unlisted. So please don't pass it out in a public way. But yes, thank you all. Thank you. See you again soon, I hope, in one way or another. Hello, Andrea, by the way. I didn't say hi earlier. We're in the same city and we haven't met up again yet. It will happen. So thank you very much. Okay, bye-bye for now.
One moment, Penelope.
Yes.
Shall we do our arrangement by email?
Oh, if you want to, if everybody wants to leave, we can have a quick chat.
Okay.
Yes, I'll switch recording off.